So I want to welcome you to Survey of Criminal Theories. Again, my name is Professor Fields. Welcome to Chapter 1. We're going to jump in and we're going to talk about crime and criminology. So what is criminology? Because it's a discipline that many people have heard of, but they're not entirely familiar on what it is. And later on in this lecture, we are going to look at the difference between criminal justice and criminology, because there are two subtle differences. When we look at criminology, we see it's an academic discipline that uses scientific method to study the nature and extent, cause, and control of criminal behavior. Essentially, what we're looking at is why do individuals engage in crime? What is the reasoning behind them engaging in crime? What causes them to engage in crime? And how can we control their criminal behavior? Now, when we look at this discipline, generally speaking, we see that it's broken into three principal divisions. The sociology of law, how laws are made, how are they enforced. We get criminal etiology, studies the causes of crime. Anything that ends in ology is the study of, it's the suffix of the study of. So criminology, the study of crime. Biology, the study of life. Sociology, the study of social issues, etc. And then we have penology, which is the study of our response to crime, as well as a study of the criminal justice system and punishment, how people are punished for breaking the law within the criminal justice system. So if we are going to look at criminology, it is extremely important to look at what criminologists do and what are some of the elements within criminology. Now, there are criminal statistics, for example, crime measurement. Within a crime management, we have to ask ourselves some questions, and we'll get to this again in our next chapter, so I'm not going to go over this too much, but we will ask ourselves some key questions. Who commits crimes? When and where does it occur? How much crime occurs annually? Which crimes are the most serious? It is extremely important for criminologists to examine key data points to determine where resources should be allocated, on top of who's committing crimes, on top of why crimes are committed, on top of where crimes are committed. So very, very important to look at and understand. Let's look at the sociology of law. This sub-area of criminology is concerned with the social, political, and intellectual influences of law and legal activity. Now, the sociology of legal institutions and legal processes, as well as the consequences of law on society. Generally speaking, criminologists will look at law, and when looking at law, they want to look at, first of all, what role does criminal law play in shaping society? We have to follow laws. I have a saying that I'm going to touch on later in the lecture, but it's very important to understand that as long as we live in a democratic society, a society with due process like we do here, laws will be important. You have to follow laws. But also, criminologists play an active role in suggesting legal changes to benefit society. We may not agree with the changes in laws occurring within our society, but criminologists are specialists. They'll say, no, we think that this law would benefit society and would keep people a lot safer in its totality, so to speak. One thing when looking at theories of crime causation, we have to ask ourselves this question: is past behavior the best predictor of future behavior? In other words, can we look at what somebody did in their past to determine how they're going to respond and react in the future? And I know that's very controversial, because you might say, well, this person in the past was nothing more than a thief, or this person in the past was nothing more than a jerk, or this person in the past was nothing more than a liar, and they're going to always be a liar, right? Are those seeds of a criminal career planted early? We're going to get into this later on in future chapters when we start diving into theories, because I want you to buckle up, put your seatbelts on. Please buckle up, because we are going to jump into theories, and we will talk about biological theories. We'll certainly talk about nature theories and nurture theories, and we'll question whether or not this has a strong indicator, on criminal behavior. And I have a nice case study that I'm going to point out later on as well. But criminologists also explore the causes of crime, and they look at them from a psychological, biological, and sociological perspective. Once again, we will touch on this, so stay tuned. Now, it's important to explain criminal behavior. This area of criminology will focus on research on specific criminal types, looking at certain patterns, looking at violent crime and theft and public order crime. There's this whole notion of the victim precipitated homicide. In other words, the victim is directly responsible for their own demise. It's very controversial, as well as white collar crime. But criminologists like to explain criminal behavior, and they'd like to do so through research methods. Now, penology. What is penology? Well, we get our word, the penal system. Anytime you hear that term, penal system, you're looking at a system which is focused on punishment, so to speak. And so with penology, it focuses on and studies the efforts to control crime through correction of criminal offenders. When somebody breaks the law, class, they have to be corrected. There is a punishment that is associated with criminal breaking, rule breaking, law breaking, right? When that punishment is met out, think about how under penology, we have to understand and we have to recognize that, a couple of things can happen within the realms of the punishment. They could be rehabilitated, as you see rehabilitation, which is they're treated as sick, they need to get treatment, they need to get help. Or we can socially control them, meaning we can provide them with a punishment to correct the behavior. And usually that punishment can include some level of incarceration, a mandatory sentence, or even worse, a capital punishment, as in death or the death penalty. So one way or another, if a person commits a crime, they will have to pay for that crime. Either the system can try to treat them to make them get better and be better and feel better, or the system can socially control them, which is to isolate them from the rest of society, meaning that they will be incarcerated, they'll be locked up, they will be put away. Now, victimology is a discipline that occurs within the field of criminology. It's now essentially its own discipline. Victimology is the study of the victim's role in criminal events. Now, victimology includes some of the following areas of interest. First of all, there's victim surveys. These victim surveys are used to measure the nature and extent of criminal behavior and calculate the costs of crime and victims. Victimology also includes services. Victimology includes, how does the victim respond in within the criminal justice system or when they encounter a criminal act. What is their risk of victimization? Who is victimized? Are they at fault, culpable? There's a lot of different areas of victimology. We will cover victimology in about chapter 3, if I'm not mistaken. So stay tuned. But I want to tell you all, whether you're in this class or you're just tuned in and you're anywhere around the country or around the world, I have a class that I lecture on this particular topic, victimology, and I have broken it down into different sub areas as well as different types of victimizations. Remember, the focus is on the victim's role in the criminal events and what is the victim's response to the criminal justice system based on the victimization. So stay tuned, but victimology is a very important discipline that criminologists have to understand and embark on. Now, I want to have a brief history of criminology, because if we're laying the foundations on what criminology is, understand that, criminology is the scientific study of crime, and criminality is relatively recent, right? Criminology is a discipline that hasn't been around since maybe about 70 years ago, give or take. But either way, it's broken into some historical categories. You have your classical criminology, the theoretical perspective suggesting that people choose to commit crime. We have a theory that's going to tie directly into this. It's the first theory we're going to go over. It's arguably one of my favorite theories. It's the theory that no matter how many theories you hear in this class, no matter how many theories that may come up in other settings, this theory is the theory that you will always remember, and it ties directly to this first bullet point. People choose to commit crime. I love this theory, but I'm just going to hold off because I don't want to get ahead of myself. We will talk about it in a couple of chapters, so stay tuned. We have positivist criminology. The use of scientific method to conduct research typically involves formulating a problem, creating hypotheses, collecting data through observation and experiment to verify the hypothesis. When looking at the positivist criminology, essentially it's coming up with a plan in that, okay, we have a hypothesis. We're not exactly sure how we're going to address this hypothesis or what is going to be the applicable theory. However, once we can identify the hypothesis and we can test it, right, now the theory becomes certified. In other words, we can now label this as a theory that has been proven as factual, right? And so with that being said, it's important to know that science has to be value-free. It can't be influenced by observer or scientist bias or political point of view. I'm going to say this. In this course, we will talk about political crime and terrorism. I know it can be a very controversial topic with the climate that we live in today. But what I want to say to you all that are listening and will be watching and tuning in is that I don't come to you all with a political bias. I don't come to you all with a political point of view because that's not my job. My job as a professor is to give you all the facts and to come and talk to you about criminology and matters of surrounding criminal justice in a completely neutral but definitive method where you all can formulate whatever opinions you want to make. So please, I just want to point that out. I very much believe in this last bullet point that the science has to be value-free and it cannot be influenced by bias or political point of view. We have sociological criminology. This argues that crime is normal because it is virtually impossible to imagine a society in which criminal behavior is totally absent. Could you imagine if we lived in a utopian society where we had no crime? You know, wouldn't that be amazing? But then if we had no crime, you don't have professors like me who are lecturing on this topic and trying to educate the masses. That's why I call myself professor for the people, you know, trying to educate the masses. You don't have the institutions that deal with crime, which we're going to talk about in just a little bit, so hang on. With that being said, we have this idea of anomie, and we'll talk about anomie again later in the semester. But anomie is defined as a lack of norms or clear social standards. In other words, society is in chaos. There's a moral uncertainty, there's a moral decay, there's a loss of traditional values. What's up is down, what's down is up, what's left is right, and so forth and so forth. And when people lack norms or don't have clear socially defined standards, then, you know, you kind of have, you know, everything's just breaking loose, so to speak. And that's this idea of anomie, and we will talk about anomie again later in the semester. Now, conflict criminology. We'll cover this as well a little bit later on. And what's interesting, class, is as I'm going through all these bullet points, we're going to cover all of these kind of on an individual basis, piece by piece, later on. With the conflict criminology, Karl Marx, he argued that the working class were exploited, and he felt that it would eventually lead to class conflict and at the end of the capitalist system. Now, we know the United States and many other advanced democracies have a capitalist system, so we obviously know that Karl Marx was incorrect here. However, Karl Marx's teachings from from nearly 100 years ago are still applicable even to this day, simply because there's this belief that you have the religious or you have the wealthy elite who are controlling everything. The working class are not getting the same fair shake, and he's arguing that we're gonna have conflict, and conflict is going to be it's absolutely going to be critical, which you have critical criminology, because as we have conflict, crime becomes becomes a product of capitalism. So when the economic system produces certain conditions to support a high crime rate, that's why people engage in crime. So once again, we will talk about this when we look at critical criminology later in the semester. But Karl Marx was definitely onto something. No, our capitalist society did not end. However, he did argue that when you have an economic system that produces certain conditions, you're going to have people that are going to resort to crime. And that is also very, very true. We have the developmental criminology, something we'll go over towards the very end of our block on the different theories. Sheldon and Eleanor Gluck, they conducted numerous studies in the 1940s and 50s, and they basically looked at careers of offenders, delinquents, and they wanted to look at what are those factors and what are those points that predict whether someone ages out, whether they are, they never age out of crime, they continue on crime. What is that age of onset? Are there multiple pathways? You can go right or left or stay straight on crime. So the Glecks were definitely onto something as well. And it is one of those things where it's very important to know and understand that developmental criminology is important. Developmental criminology is very helpful because if we could target and look at, even though it's complex, if we can target and look at a person's criminal career early on, you have a teenager, you have somebody that's young, maybe we can use targeted resources to try to get them off that path of continued criminality, and they can age out and become a productive member of society. Very complex, but we will cover it when we get to developmental criminology. And then lastly, we have the contemporary criminology. And what is contemporary criminology? We look at contemporary criminology being the key theories that we're going to go over during the semester. And these are the primary orders of what we're going to cover. Rational choice theory, which is our first and our baseline theory. Trait theory, social structure theory, social process theory, critical theory, again, tie it directly into what Karl Marx came up with. And then lastly, Sheldon Eleanor Gluck, developmental theory. So this is our contemporary criminology. This is criminology in modern times and what we're going to focus on and what the basis of criminal theories is. This is the core basis of what this course is. And I just want to show you, before we move on, when looking at the criminological perspective, what does each perspective say, and certainly what is the function area? Again, this is just something I like to put into the lecture just to kind of show you what we will really break down and talk about when we get into some of the different perspectives, not just the classical and the biological perspective, but even the structural, process, conflict, and developmental perspective. What are the forces that are at work? Situational, internal, ecological, like neighborhoods, socialization, like your upbringing, the economic and political forces, powers that you can't really control, and then of course multiple forces, everything working against a person or combined to produce crime. So let's look at this next part, deviant or criminal. How criminologists define crime. So deviant behavior is any action that departs from a social norm. Again, if we look at whether or not we had a lack of social norms, right, in our society, what's up is down, what's down is up, etc. Well, we also can argue in that same vein, deviant behavior is any action that departs from a particular social norm, and a deviant act becomes a crime when it is deemed socially harmful or dangerous. And in that case, that's where it has to be not only defined and prohibited, but it has to be punished under law. Now, crime and deviance can be very confusing because not all deviant acts are illegal and criminal. Now, I'm in Atlanta, right? And so I see graffiti all over the place. Technically, graffiti can absolutely be criminal. However, in a place like Atlanta, if you're in Detroit, if you're in Chicago, that's more or less just going to be deviant. We see somebody spray painting, we're going to probably go ahead. If law enforcement catches them, they're probably going to ticket them and cite them. And that's going to be it. They're not going to take them to jail because we need to keep the jails for the hardened criminals, right? So that's where we got to think about deviant. We got to think about where If somebody decided to go ahead and, like, I don't have any piercings per se, but let's say I had my septum pierced, so I had other body parts pierced. Some people would be like, that's a little bit deviant, because there are people who come from a very traditional, old school way that a man doesn't gonna have all these different piercings. A man's not gonna have his tongue pierced, and a man's not gonna have his septum pierced, and a man's not gonna have other body parts pierced. It's not criminal per se, right? So understand that, deviant behavior is just any action that departs from a social norm. Although we are socially acceptable to certain acts that in the past would have been viewed as deviant. So we have three views of crime, right? The consensus view of crime is that most citizens in society share common values and agree on what behavior should be defined as criminal. When we look at the consensus view of crime, we see that everybody generally says this is what's criminal. If you go ahead and you break into somebody's house, it doesn't matter if that person makes $1 million a year or that person makes $20,000 a year. That is criminal, right? Everybody can agree on the same thing, generally speaking. Then we have the conflict view of crime. Criminal behavior is defined by those in power in such a way to protect and advance their own self-interest. The wealthy and the elite are the same ones who typically define what's criminal, right? It's just like we're going to move the goalpost, so when we kick the ball and it goes here, it goes in, right? So generally speaking, as long as I'm in power, I want to protect my own self-interest. You who are not in power and you who do not have much esteem or much prestige or acclaim, so to speak, you don't get a say on what is defined as criminal behavior, right? And then we have the interactionist view of crime. And the interactionist view of crime says those with social power can impose their values on society, and these values define criminal behavior. Same thing, very similar to the conflict view. The only difference with the interactionist view is that, again, when you have social power, again, those who are wealthy, those who are elite, those who have some status in society too, they are going to say, this is how we are going to define criminal behavior. And generally speaking, we will have people enable us and people that will be around us that know it's criminal, but they're not going to say anything. As I said in my intro class, right now there is a world famous case going on. I don't have to say the name, but there's a world famous case going on with a certain mogul in New York City. And that mogul had a lot of people around him that knew what some of the behaviors were criminal. But yet, nobody defined it as criminal. Or they just said, hey, it doesn't really affect me right now because it's all good. And stuff that happened nearly 10, 12, 13 years ago, 14, 15 years ago is coming to light now. So just be aware of how people view crime. When it's happening, it is still crime and it is still criminal. Sometimes it just takes a little time before it catches up to the offender. So in terms of definition of crime, crime is a violation of societal rules of behavior as interpreted and expressed by the criminal law, which reflects public opinion, traditional values, and the viewpoint of people currently holding social and political power. Now, people who violate these rules are subject to sanctions by whatever state authority or governing body, or they can even have a loss of status. We know that if someone breaks the law, generally speaking, they can go to jail. It may not always be a given that they will go to jail. Some people can break the law and receive a summons or a notice to appear in court. But for the most part, if you commit a crime and you break the law, you will go to jail, even if you go for a few hours or if you go for a day or you go for several days or a week. But one thing that I've said, and I said this in my intro class and I'm saying it here in our first lecture, remember that ignorance of the law is not an excuse. In other words, you cannot say, I didn't know. You can't tell a judge or you can't tell a magistrate that I did not know that this was the law. There's a lot of examples out there. Where people will say, I didn't know that this was the law or I wasn't aware. And it's not an excuse. It's not an excuse. So please, please, please don't ever use the excuse, I didn't know. I highlight this because I want you to remember that for this class, ignorance of the law is not, it is never, ever an excuse. Now, is violating a moral act a crime? Because what do we see as moral acts? What's a moral act? Get a tattoo and you have a major tattoo going up and down your arm. It's not, that's not immoral, right? If you dyed your hair and you had like neon colored hair. Now we know that, for many of you that's taking this class, you may be, I'm going to assume the vast majority of you are CJ majors, or if you're watching this, you're just interested in crime and wanting to learn more. With that being said, you just have to understand that if you're looking at a real world position or a job in the real world, it might not be beneficial to walk into that interview with neon colored hair. Having said that, is violating a moral act a crime? Again, you have to see what is the definition of a crime, and then if you violate your morals, and we'll talk about morals a little bit later on, it's probably not criminal, right? So criminal behavior is tied to criminal law. The origins of criminal law are as follows. First of all, we have the Code of Hammurabi about 3,000 years ago. He's the wise king of Babylon. He established the infamous belief, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. The Code of Hammurabi was really rooted in the justification of revenge. If we all lived in this mindset, an eye for an eye, if we all had an eye for an eye, wouldn't that leave the whole world blind? I have likely done something to somebody. You have likely done something to somebody where if you could get revenge, then bam, that eye is gone. So generally speaking, it makes people question, if we keep going around this circle, an eye for an eye, eventually the entire world will be blind because everybody has done something to cause the ire and draw the ire of someone else. So just bear that in mind. We have the Mosaic Code. This was created by the Israelites, includes the Ten Commandments. You find this in the Old Testament. Moses went on Mount Sinai. God gave him the Ten Commandments. It was the law that the Israelites were instructed to follow. And it had prohibitions against murder and theft, perjury, and what to do, how to honor your father and your mother, etc. But that was the Mosaic Code. Now, common law was early English law. The thing about common law was that common law was generally only granted for English noblemen. So if you were considered a peasant, if you were a poor person, if you were just on the lower social economic rung in Great Britain or in England, then generally speaking, you didn't even get to follow common law. But what was unique about common law is that it had this thing called precedent. And precedent is that rule derived from previous judicial decisions and it's applied to future cases. We definitely borrowed common law from Great Britain because precedent will allow judges to say, well, in this particular case, this is what happened 9 out of 9 times. So I know that we have a case that's just like this. I can follow precedent and say this is what's going to happen in the conclusion of this case. What is important is what we have today, and that's contemporary criminal law. So we don't have common law, we have contemporary criminal law. And contemporary criminal law are what our current laws are today. These laws govern our society, whether we agree with them or not. We may not like the law, we may not agree with the law, but if a crime is committed and that law is broken, then generally speaking, what will happen is that there will be a punishment that will be met out. Now, if someone breaks the law, they're doing one of two things. They're committing a misdemeanor or they're committing a felony. There's no in between. Misdemeanors are less serious crimes. Felonies are more serious crimes. Now, criminal justice and criminology, they can really easily be confused. And here's why. Because see, criminology, again, looks at the etiology, the origin, the study of, right? The extent and nature of crime in society. So remember that suffix ology is the study of crime. Etiology is the origin, right? But we're looking at the extent, nature, and study of crime, right? Why someone commits crime. What's causing them to commit crime? What are some of the factors surrounding them to commit crime? People oftentimes confuse criminology with criminal justice. However, criminal justice looks the study of the agencies of social control. In other words, what are those agencies comprising of the criminal justice system? And here we go. The criminal justice system, and I highlight this because no matter where you go in life, whether you're a criminology major or you go to law school or you're just learning this just to learn this, the criminal justice system is made up of three components. No one should ever forget these components if you are a true scholar, and even if you're not a true scholar, if you just have a basic understanding of criminal justice, you will not forget this. Yes, sometimes it's easy to forget criminology because criminology looks at the study, the nature, and the extent of crime, certainly the origins of crime and the theories associated with why individuals engage in crime. But if you know criminal justice, you will not forget this. So the criminal justice system is made up of three parts: police, the courts, and the corrections. Okay? Police, the courts, and the corrections. If you don't remember anything about criminal justice, just know that it focuses on the institutions of social control, which is made up of police, the courts, and corrections. Those are the three primary components of the criminal justice system. So, kind of want to get ready to wrap this up, this first lecture of, what is criminology. And I want to give you a kind of step-by-step breakdown on the process of justice. And I think it's important to look at this, even though we're going to be focusing on theory, it's very important to look at what is the step-by-step breakdown, right? What happens when a person has an initial contact? What about an investigation? What about when an individual is arrested? What does that mean to be arrested, right? You're taken into custody. It's illegal taken into custody. If you are handcuffed and you are arrested, you can't just say, no, excuse me, I'm no longer arrested. Take these handcuffs off me. No, you are legally and lawfully detained. You don't have the right to dispute that or refute that in the moment. You have the right to dispute it and refute it later on in court, but you don't have the right to do it in that moment. What does it mean to be in custody, right? And then, of course, we have our complaint or our charging affidavit. The complaint is the formal charging document of the crime. Generally speaking, yes, there is a police report, but this complaint / police report is given to the state attorney, district attorney, prosecutor, and they're going to review it and potentially follow up and file charges as appropriate. You have other hearings and avenues that are examined and looked at. For example, you have your first appearance. This is the opportunity to go before the judge, ask for a bond or ask for a release. You have arraignment, the formal reading of charges. Think about bail or detention. For example, if somebody is granted bail, they may try to post that bail, which is the money that has to be paid to get out of jail, or they may have a bond amount, right? So they may say, all right, we're setting bail or we're setting bond at, $100,000. Well, typically you have to pay a percentage, right? That percentage is usually about 10%. So if you have a $100,000 bond or bail is set at $100,000, you got to pay 10% to get out, right? Because the rest will be covered by the bail bondsman. So 10% of $100,000 is $10,000. If you don't have $10,000 sitting in the bank, you're not getting out of jail. What happens? Some people go to what's called plea bargaining. That's where they will have their defense attorney meet with the prosecutor, and the prosecutor and the defense attorney will agree to a deal that will avoid you sitting in jail any longer. While you may do lengthy jail time, the ultimate key to the plea bargaining is to avoid a trial, because as you see right here, 90% of cases are solved with a plea bargain. The focus on this is that going to trial is expensive. It's a lot easier to avoid a trial than going to trial. And then you also have your trial process. If no plea bargain is met, then of course a criminal trial will take place. Now, lastly, you have your disposition or your sentencing. This is what happens if you are found guilty or if you accept a plea. Now you have to be sentenced. Now you're going to find out what your punishment is going to be. Are you going to jail? Are you going to be free? Are you going on probation? Are you going to prison? What's going to happen? If you didn't think you were treated fairly, a person may file an appeal. Again, if you think your lawyer did a poor job, if you think you had evidence that was withheld, most cases that where there's a conviction, immediately the person says, it's okay, we're appealing it. And it's like, you don't have any grounds to appeal it. But yet individuals will always say, oh, we're following an appeal because we know something was wrong. Well, look at right here. 10% of cases are overturned on appeal. In other words, it's a literal Hail Mary, right? It is a literal Hail Mary, just throwing something up against the wall, praying that it sticks. Once the case is disposed of, 90% of the time, it is the correct disposition. Only 10% of cases are overturned on appeal. But then we have correctional treatment, which could be going to jail, could be going to prison, or community corrections, placed on probation. You have, of course, the release. If they're incarcerated, they're released into community. They may be on parole, or they could be just released back on just straight release, meaning no supervision. And then lastly, you have your post-release or aftercare. Again, if the person is incarcerated, they would be on parole, but they would also have to undergo treatment as well, because the way the criminal justice system is working class and trying to move and shift, they want individuals receiving some level of aftercare, some level of services to ensure that they don't break the law again. So last thing, when we look at ethical issues in criminology, we have to ask ourselves a couple of questions. First of all, what do we study? How research has to be kept independent, and it has to be free of outside interference. Remember what I said about not having a political agenda or not allowing a personal or political view to be biased, right? So you have to figure out what to study, make sure it's independent, and it doesn't have any outside interference. Whom to study? Don't just ignore the middle class. Don't just ignore white-collar or organized crime. We often think that people who engage in white-collar crime or organized crime, or if they are not wealthy or elite, or, people who are seem to be well off and have it all together, we ignore them because we think, hey, they have it together. Let's focus on minorities. Let's focus on the poor. Don't ignore middle-class people. Don't ignore white-collar crime. Those people should be studied as well. And then lastly, how to study. You have to tell people that you're conducting research. First of all, you have to let them know what this research is about. Be upfront, be open, be honest. Secondly, you want to provide a great level of confidentiality. In other words, you want people to be confident in knowing that what you're researching, their information will not be given to the mainstream public, or no one will know that they provided those answers, right? If you inform them of what the purpose of the research is, you will have a greater likelihood of people offering consent to be a part of it. Not everyone's going to consent to be in the research study, because some people are very fearful of their information being compromised. But most people will say, hey, thank you for being honest. Thank you for being open. Yeah, I'll do that. I'll do that. So ethical issues in criminology will always arise if you don't know what to study, or whom to study, or how to study. Be open, be forthright, and be forthcoming. So we reached the end of chapter 1. And within this chapter, we looked at some various elements. We wanted to talk about what is criminology. We wanted to differentiate between crime and deviance. We certainly wanted to look at the views of crime, as well as some of the early laws, where our laws come from. And then lastly, we wanted to outline the criminal justice process, looking at those 15 stages within the criminal justice system. Remember, criminology deals with the study and the nature and extent of criminal behavior, the etiology or origin of crime, ology being the study of, we're studying crime. Criminal justice focuses on those social institutions of control. What are the three components of the criminal justice system which handles criminal behavior? For example, corrections, courts, and of course the first one being law enforcement. So I want to thank you for tuning in on chapter 1. Take care, stay safe, and I'll see you next time when we talk about chapter 2. Thank you.